Hey everyone, it's Srini Rao here from Notion Essentials, and today I want to talk about how you use Notion to manage your knowledge. And we really don't have any shortage of knowledge that we can consume today because initially when we take in things, they start out as information, they become knowledge, and then when we apply them to our own lives, they actually start to become wisdom. And Notion is actually a phenomenal tool for organizing and managing all of the knowledge that you acquire, whether that's in the form of class notes. So if you're taking online courses, in-person courses, if you're like me, you can take a lot of notes from the books that you read. You can also take down insights from podcasts, blog posts, articles, and do that in a number of different ways. And then, of course, you can actually copy frameworks and process templates. We'll talk about templates quite a bit more in another video. But often you'll come across sort of templates in books or processes in books for different ways of thinking, different ways of organizing ideas that you like, and you can actually use Notion to create templates. So those are a couple of the main types of knowledge that you can capture using Notion. But one of the big things that's really important is to filter all of the information that you capture. So they've actually done studies where they say when people take notes by hand, they actually tend to have better notes because they actually capture things that are relevant and they're forced to listen. Whereas if people are actually typing notes, for example, they tend to copy things that are verbatim. So when you're filtering, the big thing that you have to remember is that not everything is totally relevant. My friend Tiago Forte, who is the founder of something called Building a Second Brain, has a concept that he uses to summarize information that he consumes called progressive summarization. And the idea behind progressive summarization is to make sure that when you actually capture your knowledge, you're creating notes that are going to be useful in some way in the future, maybe actionable. You can actually use them later or refer to them later. And the idea is that you could get the gist of, for example, a source like a book by just going through your notes or looking through the notes. Whereas if you capture something verbatim, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So for example, imagine the difference between a podcast transcript and a podcast transcript that somebody basically cuts down to the core essence of that transcript and makes into an article or a blog post. You're going to tend to get a lot more from that. So there are a couple of things you need to think about when you do the information capture part. I mean, part of what makes Notion so powerful is the fact that it is a completely blank slate, but that's also what can make it really confusing and cause your Notion workspace to get really cluttered. And so what you have to think about is, where is this going to live? This is why I always say every piece of information that you capture needs to have a home. So the author Daniel Levitin wrote a book called The Organized Mind. He said, in our physical world, we actually have specific locations for everything. So for example, we have key hooks where we hang our keys. We have shoe closets where we put our shoes. And the idea of capturing knowledge and using Notion to manage your knowledge is kind of the same, where you're going to basically have designated locations for things. The other thing you want to think about is what are you going to capture? And then, what additions do you want to make to the things that you capture? So let me walk through a couple of examples. And so I'm going to go through a recent book that I just took book notes on. Notion actually is a really nice tool that allows you to create templates like this entire reading list. And I have a pretty substantial database of all the books that I've read over the last year. So this is the one that I just finished doing notes on. And it's called The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, as most of you probably have heard of. And so one of the things you'll notice here is that, I read physical books, and a lot of people do as well. And so it can be challenging to figure out what you're going to actually take as notes. There are a couple of different ways to do this. Some of you may have heard of my friend Ryan Holiday, who has something called the note card system that he learned from his mentor Robert Greene that he uses to do research and organize all of the books that he reads. And I'll actually include a link to the blog post about that as well. Tiago, who I mentioned earlier, actually uses Kindle. And when we're reading on devices, particularly like a Kindle or an iPad, the natural temptation is to highlight and underline everything. When you're going through books, there's also a natural temptation to do that. And in a lot of ways, what you actually end up capturing in your notes or into your knowledge base doesn't really make sense it doesn't make sense to just basically add every single thing that you've underlined. In fact, often what you'll find is that that thing that you underlined ended up being really useful. In the moment it seemed important, but then when you go back and look, it actually ends up not being important. So one of the things that I am actually doing now with physical books, and this is something I just came up with a few days ago, is once I'm done reading and I look at all of the various things that I've underlined, I will actually put the book down for about a week or two. This is something that Ryan Holiday actually recommended in his note card system, because often what we think is relevant in the moment won't be relevant to us later. And what I wanted to do is be able to really get the gist of what this book is about. And you can see here that I have a couple of different things. I usually just organize my notes based on the table of contents within the book. And then I go in and I look at all of the things that I think are really relevant. And so rather than capturing every single thing that I've underlined, I actually put a star next to every single thing that I know that I want to actually put into my Notion knowledge base. And books are just one example of the different ways you can do this. But what you'll see here is that I've highlighted things that I think are incredibly important, sort of the core ideas. So I could literally just scroll through this thing. And so if you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, there's sort of some really big ideas that matter and stick out of the book. And of course, he supports them with some really amazing examples to talk about all of this. But I don't need to go through the examples. I want to be able to apply these things to my own life or to my own creative work. And you'll see here that basically he talks about the 3 rules of epidemics, and then I go in and I expand. And so what I tend to do is I actually use header 2s for each chapter and then header 3s for the subheadings within each chapter. And again, you'll see the things that I highlighted are the things that I think are most important. There are also things that you can bold as well. If you go and read Tiago Forte's blog post on progressive summarization, which I'll also include a link to, you'll see that he has sort of what he calls 4 or 5 different layers. The first layer is to capture the note. The next layer is to look at the things that are bold. Then you highlight, and he says, if you really want to get the most out of a source like this, then you go and you basically do something like write a blog post about this. But you can see here that basically I can go through and I can get all the core ideas from the tipping point because of the fact that I was filtering to the point that I wanted to only get the things that I felt I really wanted to put inside of this note. Now, earlier I also mentioned, talking about what other information do you want to capture. You can notice here that, I have various filters here. I basically tag every single thing within my reading database with a topic. I can also put in a URL here, which I've not done yet. I always make sure I note the author. And then, if I wanted to, I can add a book cover. So if you go back to the reading list, what you'll see here is that it's pretty substantial. And then you actually have the ability to sort the database. So for example, I can sort it by the name of the author, and you can see here that I have book notes basically from all these different authors. And this is a process I go through just for book notes, but it's something that you could do, for example, if you're capturing podcast insight. Let's say you have a particular podcast that you love. I happen to be the host of a podcast called Unmistakable Creative, where we interview lots of people. And so if I wanted to, I could take the transcripts of the interviews and do a very similar thing and do sort of the progressive summarization approach that Tiago talks about. And so let me go back to the main workspace, and you'll see here. So we talked about this. One other thing I want to talk about is templates. So one of my favorite tools is to use templates within Notion. And as I said, I'll do a second video on how to create templates and how to use them. But you'll see here that we have different templates, and probably this is my favorite one that we use the most frequently, and it's the new project template. So when we create a new project, and this idea basically came from Scott Belsky's book, Making Ideas Happen. And so he has a framework within Making Ideas Happen where he basically boils a project down to action steps, reference materials, and back burner items. So anytime I want to create a new project, I just do that, and then I put it in a page for that project. So for example, we could call this new project Srini's Notion Essentials video, or Srini's Notion Essentials YouTube channel. So we'll create a page, and then we'll move all of those items into this page, and now you basically have a project page. And the thing is that we're always coming across various things inside of books, frameworks, things that we want to use, as I mentioned earlier in the video. And often we just end up taking notes on them, but they don't end up being particularly useful because of the fact that we actually don't have a way to organize that information. So something as simple as that is another form of how you actually organize knowledge or manage knowledge in Notion. So now, anytime I want to work on this Notion Essentials YouTube channel, you'll see here that I have all the various action steps. And Scott's book is another one of those things that I highly recommend. You'll see here we can just add various tasks. We can assign them to people. We can have due dates. And you can see here he basically goes into detail about what these various things are done for us. An action step obviously is very clearly the action that you're going to take on a particular project. So in the case of this, project, it could be publish video to YouTube and then share on social or whatever it is. And so, if you, for example, come across something like a copywriting template or a sales page template in an online course, you could actually create a template for that within Notion. Or if somebody shows you a framework for outsourcing things, another one that is kind of popular, there's an article on the internet titled Your Path to the $1,000 an Hour Mindset, where the guy actually has you go through and make a list of $10 tasks, $100 an hour tasks, and $1,000 an hour tasks, and put them into columns. So you could actually do that at the end of every week, and you could create a template for that. So this is just sort of a very high-level way of organizing knowledge within Notion. As you can see here, this is my knowledge base from my other business, Unmistakable Creative. And so basically, I just wanted to kind of show exactly how you organize Notion, knowledge in Notion. And so you can see we can link various workspaces. So this is my Notion Essentials workspace where I'm keeping it separate from the other workspace. We'll get into a whole conversation about workflows and workspaces in another video. But that's at a very high level how you manage your knowledge. I think the important thing to understand about managing knowledge inside of Notion is that no matter what tool you use, the tool is to actually support your efforts. And if you don't actually go through the theory earlier, it doesn't really matter what tool you use if you're not thinking about this in terms of what you're going to filter, what you're going to capture, and how you're going to organize it. Because if you don't do that, then it doesn't really matter, because then you just end up with this jumbled up mess of things that you actually can't make really a lot of sense of or do anything actionable with later. Whereas having all of this in some sort of format is incredibly useful. So for example, I actually often refer to my book notes when I'm writing new blog posts, so I can use quotes from those blog posts. I can do all sorts of stuff. So that's at a high level how you manage knowledge, or basically capture the things that you're consuming and filter out relevant information inside of Notion. If you want to learn more about all the various things that you can do with Notion, just sign up for our newsletter at notionessentials.com. We'll actually give you an opportunity to do a free 15-minute workflow audit to help you set up your Notion workspace as well. Again, visit notionessentials.com to learn more. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below.